everyone, and happy World Town Planning Day. My name is Maggie Krause, and I am the APA Staff Liaison to Divisions, Interest Groups, and the Divisions Council. So thanks so much for joining us this morning. World Town Planning Day is an opportunity to unite planners and celebrate planning around the globe. So this morning, we're pleased to present this conference, which is hosted and facilitated by the International Division, and it's going to cover topics spanning resilience, environmental regulations, and sustainable cities. Just want to share a few items before we begin. Today's program will be recorded and shared on the World Town Planning Day webpage at planning.org. There you will also find information about how to claim CM credit for today's programs. Next, we're going to save some time at the end of the presentation for questions. So if you have a question, I encourage you to use the questions panel on the navigation bar, which is on the right side of your screen. Finally, I encourage everyone to join the conversation on social media today by using the hashtag WTPD2019. So with that, I'll hand it over to Raisa from the International Division.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. My name is Raisa Kwame, and I am the APA International Division's World Town Planning Day online conference coordinator. The title of this webinar is Shared Experiences in Advancing Inclusive and Equitable Climate Adaptation. I will now welcome our panelists. Drew Curtis is the Senior Equitable Development Manager at the Ironbound Community Corporation. Robin Lashenko is Professor and Chair of Geography at Rutgers University and the Co-Director of the Rutgers Climate Institute. Kate Wakour is the Director of Resilience for the Waterfront Alliance, overseeing the organization's portfolio of resilience work. Jeannie Herb directs the Environmental Analysis and Communications Group at Rutgers University Bluestein School. Sarah Vancheli is a coastal management specialist with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's Office for Coastal Management.
Hi everyone. Thanks so much for the introduction. Again, my name is Jean Herb. I'm with the Rutgers University Bluestein School. What I'd like to do is to take just a few minutes to talk you through a project that we're working on here that's been supported by NOAA. I believe my project manager, Michael Kolber from the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection, is probably joining us as well. The project's titled A Seat at the Table, Integrating Socially Vulnerable Populations into Climate Resilience Planning. It's a project of special merit, which is funded by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration here in the United States. And has been awarded to the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection in partnership with us, with Rutgers University. We also have a great project working group, which includes a really interesting group of partners, which includes public health professionals, which includes social service providers that work with socially vulnerable populations from throughout the state, includes environmental justice and frontline community representatives, and also different organizations that work with people who live in poverty, people who have issues associated with health inequities, and other challenges that face socially vulnerable populations. What you see in front of you is a little infographic that our project working group came up with. That represents some of the concepts that have been emerging as part of our project as we've spent some time talking to key informants throughout the project and also engaging residents in socially vulnerable communities to talk about some of the challenges that vulnerable populations face associated with climate resilience. So the objectives of the project, we have three objectives to the project. The first is to enhance access to data regarding socially vulnerable populations, to allow planners to be able to have better access to data to understand what populations have inherent vulnerabilities to climate impacts, and to be able to understand the vulnerabilities that those populations and those communities face, to be able to better address some of the inherent vulnerabilities that those populations face. The second objective is to develop guidance and outreach materials to work with planners and other resilience professionals to help them to better understand how to engage socially vulnerable populations as part of resilience planning. And then the third is to offer recommendations for policy changes, particularly policy changes associated with coastal management and coastal management policies to better improve the integration of socially vulnerable populations as part of resilience planning. So just to kind of give you a sense of how we're viewing resilience planning, or where we're kind of fitting in. So the first bar here reflects on emergency management and recovery, which is the concept or the activity associated with recovery immediately after a disaster event. So those kinds of days and weeks right after an event. There's certainly opportunities to address the needs of vulnerable populations and vulnerable communities with regard to emergency management and recovery. But that's not really the focus of the work that we're doing. We're really focused on the second bar, which is climate resilience planning, which is working in communities and with residents, with planners in communities to think forward, to think about what communities are facing in the future with changing climate conditions, to better understand what communities can be doing now to adapt to those future conditions, to better understand what changes can happen in communities to build resilience now for those future conditions. A third sort of really interesting and emerging approach to resilience planning is what I'm framing as equity-driven, community-based risk reduction strategies, which other folks on the panel will be talking about, which is very much leading with equity as a core fundamental approach to driving, reducing risk as a result, risk that comes from changing climate conditions, and looking at addressing the underlying structural inequities in a community. The place that we are, the sort of sweet spot that we're finding right now in terms of the work that we're doing, and again, in part because this is coming from a coastal resilience program and funded through NOAA, is that second bar in terms of longer term climate resilience planning with a focus on coastal hazards and coastal management and coastal policies. So as we think about resilience, the traditional and typical definition of resilience is the ability of a community to bounce back after hazardous events, including hurricanes, coastal storms, and flood hazards, including not necessarily just extreme weather events, but also sea level rise and sunny day flooding. Social vulnerability is often defined as the degree to which a community, so again, what I want to stress here, it's the degree to which a community as well as individuals exhibit social conditions such as high poverty, low percentage of vehicle access, or crowded households, and the extent to which those characteristics may affect the community's ability to be resilient after a disaster or after changing, or as a result of changing climate conditions. The Centers for Disease Control the U.S. Centers for Disease Control has put together an index, the SVI index, which is the box on the left of the slide here, shows you the indicators that are used in the CDC SVI index. And they're organized in 4 categories: socioeconomic status, household composition and disability, minority status and language, and housing and transportation. And so the other boxes to the right of those 4 themes show you what the specific indicators are that are on this CDC index. This is a very helpful index in terms of starting to better understand who are the populations within a community that have inherent social vulnerability, and the extent to which an overall community may exhibit overall vulnerabilities. As part of the work that we've been doing, we have been using the CDC index to better understand what some challenges a community may face. But what we've also done is we've spent some time talking to community organizations, social service organizations, and then also residents to better understand What are some other populations that may also be vulnerable in addition to these that have been identified by the Centers for Disease Control? And some of the additional vulnerabilities that we've identified are, in addition to poverty, but is the concept of families that are working poor. So historically, the conversation with regard to social vulnerability is thinking about poverty and poverty levels. But what we're hearing more and more is that those indices of poverty are often limiting, and we really need to start to think about people that are working, may even have health insurance, but are still not able to kind of meet their ends at the end of a month, pay all their bills. Maybe they're paying their bills, but they're not really able to fully be resilient because that it's just very tight in their households. Second is definitely veterans, communities that are historically underinvested in as a result of potentially structural racism, potentially just disinvestment overall in terms of historic trends in the United States. And then another category that has been raised that's not reflected in the CDC index are communities that experience disproportionate environmental burden. So these are some categories that we've been exploring. So again, as part of one of the objectives and tasks here is to look to complement the CDC index with gathering additional data and making data available to practitioners here in New Jersey. So another task that we've undertaken is that we've, as I've mentioned, we've spent a lot of time talking to key informants, so different leaders here in New Jersey who work with socially vulnerable populations, and then also we've done some focus groups with residents. So there's 6 kind of key messages that we've heard from this engagement. The little blue call-out box at the top is actually a quote that we received as part of this engagement. So these 6 messages and the messages that we've heard are consistent from the focus groups with residents, as well as what we've heard from some of the key informants who work closely with socially vulnerable populations. So number 1 is that the concept of vulnerability is a factor of individuals as well as whole communities. Oftentimes when, I think historically or traditionally, when there's and particularly in the emergency management context, when we think about vulnerability, we think about individuals. We think about how are we going to evacuate a senior citizen, or how are we going to attend to a person who maybe needs oxygen, right, if there's going to be a power outage, or how are we going to take care of people who have physical disabilities. But what we're hearing more and more and learning more and more is that it's an entire community that may have vulnerabilities, whether that's because of underinvestment or because of disproportionate environmental burden. So thinking about a community as a whole and not just as a set of individuals. The second message that we've heard is that underlying social inequities and the challenges that are faced as a result are the biggest hurdle to achieving resilience. So that whether it's poverty or racism or limited access to conditions that allow a person to live a happy and healthy life, whether that's access to health care, or whether it's access to a living wage job, or whether that's access to transportation services, or access to an affordable home. All of those challenges are the challenges that really underlie social vulnerability. And what we really heard so loud and clear is that for socially vulnerable populations, they're really living on the edge, and that the concept of changing climate conditions, even if it's just a flooding event, not even an extreme weather event, just a sunny day flooding event, is enough to push those populations over the edge. A third message we heard is that government has a role to play, but not the only role, and that it's critical that they are developed in partnerships with communities and that more and more capacity becomes integrated into communities. We've heard that historically, socially vulnerable populations don't have a seat at the table, and that the same populations that are especially vulnerable to changing climate conditions are the same populations that have historically not been involved in decision making with regard to their communities. We've heard that there's a perception, I can't confirm whether this is true or not, among socially vulnerable populations that resources that are associated with resilience planning and recovery planning are disproportionately distributed to communities and populations that already have sufficient capacity. And then finally, another message that we heard loud and clear is that participatory processes, greater engagement of socially vulnerable populations is definitely a critical strategy to ensure that socially vulnerable populations' needs are addressed as part of resilience planning. So what that allows us to think about, and this concept has come from our project work group, is that there's a need to redefine the concept of resilience from bouncing back to the way we were before to the concept of bouncing forward to improved conditions where people can live in communities that are healthier, greener, cleaner, more equitable, and more prosperous, and more resilient. And so this concept of bouncing forward is something that what we're realizing is when you're starting to think about resilience and think about resilience through an equity lens, or think about resilience through a social vulnerability lens, is really that resilience becomes this opportunity. It becomes an opportunity for improved communities. So in terms of the status of our project, this is our little scaffold. On the bottom of the slide in the blue box is 3 bullets of the initial tasks that we had underway, and I want to thank our project manager for the design of the project because it was actually very well thought out. So the project kind of scaffolds on these initial tasks. So initially we did a lit review, and then we did this stakeholder engagement that I mentioned with some of the clear messages that we've heard, and then we reviewed the Centers for Disease Control data. And then we started to look at some of the additional data that we can make available for resilience planners. The bullets above it with the little arrows are now the tasks that we're focused on now. And these tasks are scaffolded, have built upon those first tasks. So this is what we're working on now. We're looking at building additional data sets to try to address some of the other elements of social vulnerability that we've heard about needing to have data on to make available to resilience planners. So we've identified data, for example, regarding municipalities that are in overall distress. We've identified data regarding homelessness. We've identified data regarding veteran status. And other sets of data such as that. And now we're compiling these data, and I'll talk about that in just a little bit more. The second task that we're focused on is developing training and guidance and policy recommendations. So these 3 tasks are what we're focused on now. In terms of data development and access, these are some of the data that we're looking at now. We're looking at, as I mentioned, municipal distress, homelessness. We're looking at that asset-limited, income-restrained, employed households, which is that working poor kind of data. We're looking at the age of housing, population density, and also that kind of environmental burden. And these are all data that we think can help complement the Centers for Disease Control. So the issue here with data is not just having more data available to resilience planners here in New Jersey, but making it available. So these data are going to be, are currently being developed, and they're going to be made available here in New Jersey publicly through what's called New Jersey Flood Mapper, which is a web-based data visualization and mapping tool that is hosted here at Rutgers University. If you Google it, New Jersey Flood Mapper, it'll take you to it, so you can go online and make maps and make pretty maps and map your town. And so these data will now become very accessible, along with the Centers for Disease Control Index, which is currently up there on New Jersey Flood Mapper. So resilience planners will have access to these data as they look to engage socially vulnerable populations as part of their resilience planning. In terms of our training work, we're going to be developing a training protocol, and this we're going to be doing in partnership with NOAA. The objectives of the training work is to really focus on these particular tasks. The training objectives, which when we're done next spring, will be publicly available, the training will focus on how to identify socially vulnerable populations and communities, and to help participants better understand what are the factors that contribute to vulnerability. To help participants to understand where in the planning process are there opportunities to involve socially vulnerable populations in resilience planning. The next is to better understand equity, diversity, and inclusion opportunities, and what some of the complexity is associated with EDI as part of community-based planning. We'll certainly be training on how to use the data tools that we'll be developing. And then finally, the training will also focus on building skills for participatory processes, particularly in terms of equitable participatory processes that bring socially vulnerable populations who may not have historically had a seat at the table to the table as part of resilience planning. And then finally, our last task in the project is to pull together some recommendations for the state policy here in New Jersey. Again, the focus of the policy recommendations will be on coastal policies, again, because this is a project that has grown out of coastal risk and coastal hazards associated with changing climate conditions. I suspect we will probably blur lines a little bit in terms of some of those recommendations, but that's a task in the project that'll sort of come in the last quarter, and that'll be a focus kind of starting in December until March. The overall project will come to completion in March of 2020. So thank you very much. I hope that gives some good background and also lays the groundwork for my other colleagues who are on the panel. Thank you very much.
All right. Good morning, y'all. Again, my name is Drew Curtis. I get to work for Ironbound Community Corporation, and I'm going to kind of give an example of how our community has really done resilience planning with that environmental justice and climate justice lens. So our organization, we're a 50-year-old multi-service community-based organization. It really has been that like neighborhood anchor for residents to go to, doing everything from early childhood education and youth development, social services and workforce development, and then our environmental justice and community development team that I am a part of that does a lot of the community organizing and advocacy, public policy work, community planning, urban farming, affordable housing development, that stuff too. And we're focused in the Ironbound section of Newark, which for those not familiar, makes up most of the east ward of Newark, and it's everything to the east of the Amtrak Northeast Corridor line, called Ironbound, because literally it's bound in by rail, whether it's freight rail to the south and to the east, or to the west, the Amtrak line, and then there even used to be rail cutting across the old Central Railway line that cut across the north side of our neighborhood too. So we're a community of about 50,000 people. It's always been an immigrant neighborhood. Today that means a lot of South and Central Americans, particularly from Brazil and Ecuador, as well as a significant African-American population, primarily residing in public housing and publicly subsidized housing too. And we are an environmental justice community, being right next door to the Port of Newark, which is the second largest in the country, Newark Airport. The Passaic River itself is the longest Superfund site in the country, poisoned by dioxin, which was the active ingredient in Agent Orange, because it was manufactured in our neighborhood too. Also have the state's largest garbage incinerator, the largest wastewater treatment plant on the East Coast, and over 150 brownfield sites and many other warehouses and polluting facilities in our neighborhood too, like a fat rendering plant. This just talks a little bit more about that too, about where some of the sites are located in our community. And then when Superstorm Sandy hit now 7 years ago, really was a wake-up call for us that we knew we had to get serious on planning for climate change resilience too, because the east end of our neighborhood was really decimated by the storm too. And it wasn't just the storm surge that came up in tidal waves in two directions from the Passaic River, and then also up from Newark Bay and the Arthur Kill. That really just decimated our neighborhood too, but it mixed with the brownfield sites, active industries, etc. And it was this toxic flooding too that really hit our neighborhood too, that ended up pouring into people's homes and basements. As you can see here, this just gives a little bit of the larger regional context of the storm too, that talks about what I was talking about. And then this is on top of everyday flooding that we have to deal with from combined sewer overflow. Those are just pictures after regular rainfalls that happen in our neighborhood all the time. There's lots of property damage and health issues that are caused by this flooding too. And we know with the future vulnerability with sea level rise too, and the forthcoming FEMA flood maps, we're extremely vulnerable. Half of our neighborhood will be in a flood zone too. So we need to make sure that we're prepared for what's happening here. So in 2015, we were able to get the support of the Kresge Foundation as part of their Climate Resilience and Urban Opportunity Program to develop a Newark Resiliency Action Plan that focused on adaptation, mitigation, and social cohesion too. So changing how we do things, but also looking to reduce greenhouse gases, but make sure that residents are at the heart of this type of work too. We partnered with two other organizations the New Jersey Environmental Justice Alliance and then Clean Water Fund, where each of us focused local planning in a different ward, ourselves here in the East Ward, and particularly the South Ironbound, where we actually partnered with the APA New Jersey chapter and their pro bono program too, to help us with some of the local planning on the ground. And then in the South Ward was Clean Water Fund, and then the West Ward was the New Jersey Environmental Justice Alliance. And really what our process looked like, it starts with like going to residents and making sure that they're at the heart of the work that we're doing. And asking them, what are the issues in their neighborhood? Not even talking about climate change. First, just talking about the issues. And then later introducing some of the climate justice terms and climate change terms too, so they understand it. Then we would bring it up to a citywide multi-sector steering committee to get ideas and talk about what's implementable to address neighborhood issues. From there, we would draft strategies and then go back to the community first. Then again, go back to the steering committee, but again, going to the community often. And then we'd come up with that final plan and implementation. Again, go back to the community too. So like one last time to confirm the plan, but then also keep working with them as well as our steering committee partners to implement this plan too. It's an iterative process. It doesn't stop once. Yeah, so just some pictures that we've been doing throughout this process too, of both community meetings and stakeholder meetings too. So what the 5 elements of the plan really emerged as community priorities are minimizing flooding, and again, minimizing that toxic flooding that I was talking about earlier. Also reducing temperatures and adapting to the heat impacts due to the urban heat island effect. Then preparing for and responding to extreme weather situations. Reducing greenhouse gases and local air pollution, some of those co-pollutants that happen in our neighborhood. And then minimizing blackouts and stopping the use of dirty energy through both energy efficiency and renewable energy opportunities. And we were to accomplish these goals, we combined policy development from the local to the federal, on the ground projects in those 3 target wards, and then community empowerment that were really creating long lasting resident climate justice advocates. Our goal that I always say is to put ourselves as a nonprofit out of business. The residents can just keep up the fight and take up the fight too. We're not needed. That's the goal of our work. And again, resiliency action is essential to mobilizing residents that we've participated in national alliances like the Climate Justice Alliance and their different actions and rallies, such as the 2014 rally in New York City in March, and then in 2017 in Washington, D.C. For both of them, we brought 100 Newarkers out to participate too. But then also action at the state level too. This other picture is about around the energy master plan too, that the state is currently working on too. We want to make sure that the needs of environmental justice communities are at the forefront. We've been advancing a lot of green infrastructure in our neighborhood too, and it's something that's one of the preferred approaches to dealing with flooding. Not only because it helps solve flooding, but also because of co-benefits like reducing urban heat island effect and improving air quality as well too. Riverfront Park, which opened in actually a couple months before Hurricane Sandy, and it served as a natural buffer where before it was a lot of pavement and shipping containers blocking the view. It transformed into this green space too, which prevented flooding. While we saw flooding on both sides of the park, where the park was, it was this natural buffer too. So these are the types of things we want to see more of. We're continuing to develop our resiliency work, whether it's in our East Ironbound neighborhood plan or in the South Ironbound plan too, in the demonstration green district too. And again, we need to keep doing this ongoing education and even job training too, or getting the youth involved to lead, because they're the ones that are going to be most affected moving forward too. So getting young adults involved, but also working to boost incomes. There is a lot of money that's going to be spent, millions and if not billions of dollars, on making our community more resilient, such as with the long-term control plan for combined sewer overflow issues and many other issues. And we want to make sure that residents get a share of that so they can boost their incomes too and can be more involved in coming up with future solutions too. And again, we have to be mindful too, as we're building climate resilience, we're not contributing to gentrification and displacement too. So as we develop new green spaces and green infrastructure, and reducing air pollution and greenhouse gases, we're still allowing that current residents could stay here too. So we have to make sure that we have policies in place that we're preserving our existing low-income housing and have strong rent control and tools like right to counsel legislation and landlord-tenant court or inclusionary zoning, developing new permanently affordable housing with community land trusts and housing cooperatives too. So we need to make sure that's in line too. So yeah, thank you for listening to me, and there's my information if you want to learn more. I'll turn it over to my next panelist.
Great. Thank you. Oh, I'm showing my screen now. This is Kate Boycourt. Let me just bring it up. View full screen. Okay, hopefully you can see that. So thank you, Drew and Jean. I just want to say that I'm in awe of the work that you do on the ground and the full service operation going on at Ironbound Community Corporation, but also the New Jersey Climate Adaptation Alliance. If you have not checked out some of the publications that they've got going on, we actually cite a lot of their work and really have something to stand on as advocates, which is really what I'm going to talk about. I sit in a slightly different role, and we'll be talking a little bit about how we're developing a campaign essentially to push for some of the policy recommendations that both folks like the Adaptation Alliance and also grassroots communities are really raising as their need for adapting in New York and New Jersey. So I'll talk a little bit about, in general, what we're doing, the problem, and sort of how we're seeing the lens of the problem in our region, and a little bit about process of what we're working on, and then really just focus mostly on some of the priorities that are coming out from an equity and justice perspective at the federal, state, and local level in both states. So we are, okay, it is slow. Jean, I'm not sure how you, oh, there we go. Okay. So just briefly sweeping through our organization, we are a bi-state organization working in the northern part of New Jersey, top 6 counties from Monmouth to Bergen, and all of New York City. And we're really focused on our waterfront, but our waterfront and beyond that, in that we want essentially a thriving region for generations to come. And we know that we rely on our water for everything. We rely on it. It's our, in New York City, it's our 6th borough and largest public space. And in New Jersey, it ties our communities together, and it's both incredibly impacted, especially in Newark and the Passaic River where Drew is. And so, you know, we want that to be healthy and thriving, and hey, we want it to last for generations to come, and the people that live here to be able to enjoy this great resource and just you know, manage their own lives and communities and succeed. So just briefly, we've got a few programs that we do. We certainly are a big convener. We're an alliance of over 1,000 groups, from civic to environmental to community development to business to agencies. And we're really focusing, you know, obviously that group does not always get along, but we do agree that there should be a platform for the waterfront. And increasingly, everything that we care about is at risk. And I'll talk a little bit about, you know, what that is specifically here. But we've been doing a number of things. We do early childhood education, getting kids out on the water. We are advocates, and again, that's what I'll be talking about primarily today, is how we sort of take a lot of this stuff and advocate, in addition to the kind of advocacy that has been done, really build a big platform for, in the same way the greenhouse gas reduction and mitigation community has made some progress in a region. We really want to see adaptation lifted up as important an issue as reducing our greenhouse gases. We do have a program called the Waterfront Edge Design Guidelines, which is a LEED-like certification for waterfront projects. And through that's really available online. We work with communities and professionals to design better from a resiliency, access, and ecology perspective. So just briefly, a little bit of the lens of the problem. We have over 1 million people in the floodplain today. So this is not a problem in the future. You know, it's a problem with the present as well as the future. Just at a national scale, we are $20 billion in debt in the National Flood Insurance Program, and in 1 year alone, in 2017, we suffered $317 billion in damages, and that's equivalent to the GDP of Ireland. So, you know, it's it's costing us now. And we know that we can, we pay less if we invest in resilience now, whether that be social resilience, ecological resilience, or infrastructure. We also know that, as I think a number of our panelists alluded to already, that the issue is not distributed equitably. And our public housing is disproportionately, we have, many developments in the floodplain, and also disproportionately, we know that higher poverty rates are actually in the floodplain thanks to work by the Furman Center. In both states, we actually higher than the average national level in our floodplain. So the idea that the floodplain and coast is a rich place to live is actually just not true. We've got both ends of the spectrum. And as Jean alluded to also, we've seen that federal disaster money actually does favor the rich, and it widens wealth gaps along racial lines. And there was some really good work done by NPR and others, building off of research that's been done by academics that's online. You can listen to it. It's a great short thing. And, ecologically, this is also at the front lines, and this is something that we've lost in our region. We've lost over 85% of our wetlands already that used to protect us. We filled them in and we built on top of them, and that's kind of where we are. So, and there's more at risk. So what can we do about that? And also, if you ask people that live through Sandy, that live at the front lines, they know that they're at risk, but a lot of people that might be coming from elsewhere, they don't necessarily know. And we actually have the worst grades in the nation for flood risk disclosure in both states. But increasingly, it's not just about money. And I think that's one thing that we're really trying to hit home and to our government agencies as well, is that we really need to start thinking about the future that we want and the values that we care about. So, we're trying to capture that in the policy advocacy that we will be doing. So in order to sort of get at that, we have been building consensus since early this year, as I said, with a lot of the civic, environmental, frontline environmental justice, businesses, agencies, academics, climate scientists, housing experts, to get together in a resilience task force, alternating between Newark and New Jersey, trying to bring states together to kind of, figure out what are the things that we need to push for as advocates. So we're kind of in the middle of that process right now. I've been working with our co-chairs, and which I've failed to mention. We've got incredible leadership. We have Peggy Shepard from We Act for Environmental Justice, and Pete Kasabak from New Jersey Future, and also Peter Madonia, formerly of the Rockefeller Foundation, and really kind of helped develop 100 resilient cities that are kind of leading us. And then we have all these subcommittees that are working on different things, which you'll see in this slide, including we've got leadership from Ironbound Community Corporation as well, on especially the equity and just process, because you guys and Drew and others know a lot more than we do about long-term engagement in communities and how do we do this equitably. So we've been focusing on sort of who pays for this, who decides. We've got governance that's not really yet adapted to the challenge. What are we aiming for? How do we measure this, and what strategies are we looking for? And how do we make sure it's equitable, and how do we make sure that it reaches people? And I think that is the largest challenge, is both having a two-way street where the public is aware that it's an issue that affects them. We've got over 400,000 jobs are directly or indirectly connected to our port alone. And so if that kind of goes down, a lot of the unemployment issues that Jean is talking about are worse. We've got we had a gas crisis after Hurricane Sandy. I watched the gas lines in my neighborhood in Brooklyn after that storm, and it was stark, and that's what we've got in our future if we do not prepare. So just a sneak peek of some of the things that we will likely be pushing for, and we are coming out with a draft of this to our Resilience Task Force, which represents over 300 individuals and organizations that have been giving us input. And then we're going to continue to kind of vet these priorities amongst grassroots organizations at the front lines, and academics and others that have been really focusing on this issue. so one of the things that I think was mentioned by Jean is supporting individual and collective action. And I think, just process is really been something that's been kind of missing largely, with the exception of projects and, organizations like Ironbound kind of really going in and facilitating and making sure that communities are actually, enabled to be part of the decision-making process and at the table. Another thing that is, we're coming into this with public infrastructure that's pretty much get an F grade or C grade or D grade by the American Society of Civil Engineers across the board. And these are the infrastructure, whether it be public housing or getting to work on your train. These are already in terrible shape. So we really need to be investing in those because, if you don't have a car or you rely on these public infrastructures to live and work, that is something that needs to be in shape. Another thing, we talked a little bit about this, but our National Flood Insurance Program really doesn't have enough focus on equity, and there's a great report that sort of suggests that housing burden is really a good way. I think Jean might actually have some additions to that based on her research of sort of how to make sure that we're subsidizing and supporting individuals that can take action, and also providing with them the resources to look at other options, including retrofits, relocation if they choose, and really providing resources for them to make decisions that are super hard and nobody really wants to make. And then also importantly, we're looking at cost benefit analyses and criteria that our federal and state and local funding sources use. I would say that there's a huge process in the region, the New York, New Jersey Harbor and Tributary Study by the Army Corps of Engineers that really kind of leaves out community decision making as part of the process. And we need to be funding that as part of any process. So that's sort of something that is missing throughout a lot of pieces of the way that we fund, even if we might include equity lenses later on in the process, or we might nod to them in criteria. They really need to be decision making and prioritization of triple bottom line solutions, and low income and communities of color need to be really integrated into those processes. So those are places that we expect to push on. And also, I think, a lot of the buyout or acquisition programs that happened after Sandy were really in response to Sandy, with the exception of New Jersey actually has a robust and existing program that's been for a long time to acquire areas for conservation land. But we didn't actually have all the resources or mission alignment that we needed to help residents really think about this issue, counsel them, provide trauma therapy, and also think about how do we provide resources for relocation and not just acquisition. And I think our agencies had to kind of do that on the fly and really need more resources to get there. So that's just a summary of some of the issues that we'll be pushing on from the equitable and just piece, although that there's others from a governance and funding perspective. And I just want to nod quickly before I close. We're also going to be standing up for the issue. We piloted this a little bit through City of Water Day this past year through some of our colleagues in New York and a little bit in Elizabeth, New Jersey, to stand at the future floodplain line and kind of demonstrate a need for this action. And it's part of a big action that we expect to do early next year. So with that, I'll close and pass it on to our next speaker.
Great, thank you. This is Sarah Vandershally with NOAA's Office for Coastal Management, and I'm just going to click real quick to let it show my screen. One moment. Okay. Great, so thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to learn from the other panelists and to share the work that our partners are doing and to talk about what we're striving towards in NOAA's Office for Coastal Management to support this important work. And hold on, might be advancing in just one moment. I'll just let you know that I'm going to provide a short introduction to our office for some context and then share a few examples and then talk about opportunities. And is it advancing for you? Okay, well, I'll just keep talking and hopefully the slides will catch up at some point. So in our office, we do a large part of our work through partnerships. We administer the National Coastal Zone Management Program, the National Estuarine Research Reserve System, and the Coral Reef Conservation Program. We are also the federal host of the Digital Coast, which is both an online platform to deliver actionable data, tools, and training to coastal managers and communities. And it's also a partnership with a number of organizations, including APA. Now, for additional context for the National CZM program, it's a voluntary state-federal partnership, and I was hoping to pull up, maybe I'll just escape out of this. It seems like it, oh, there it goes. Oh, great, thank you. Okay, so this is a map. It shows the dark blue states and territories on here are all participating by implementing programs that manage land and water resources. Many of these programs support adaptation and resilience planning at the state and local level and are beginning or have been thinking about inclusion and equity and how to increase it within their programs. The other map I wanted to show was the National Estuarine Research Reserve system map. There are 29 reserves located around the country, and through this system we have an incredible network of place-based partners working in their stewardship, research, monitoring, training, and education roles with local communities around the country. And this is a word cloud that shows many of the coastal management topics that we focus on in our office and that our partners focus on. And all of these issues impact marginalized and vulnerable communities. So as we are moving ahead to support these communities as they work towards solutions, we know this is of huge importance. And fortunately, through the partnership programs I mentioned, OCM, that's our office, is learning about lessons and strategies for advancing equity in coastal management. So I'm going to take a moment to share a couple of examples from our partners. I'm going to jump up, over to the Pacific Coast, to California, and move from maybe a local to more of a state level example. So in California, there are 3 state agencies that make up the California Coastal Management Program. That includes the California Coastal Commission, and they manage development along the outer coast. The San Francisco Bay Conservation and Development Commission, which oversees development in the Bay, and the California State Coastal Conservancy. So they work along the entire length of the California coast and the San Francisco Bay Area. They're non-regulatory, and they really focus on purchasing, protecting, restoring, and enhancing coastal resources. Over the past several years, each of these agencies has been working on towards changing the way they work to be more inclusive and equitable. So I'm going to share some of their recent work and then some of the best practices and lessons learned that they shared with me from their staff. So in March of this year, the California Coastal Commission unanimously adopted its first environmental justice policy. The purpose is to achieve more meaningful engagement, equitable processes, effective communication, and stronger coastal protection benefits that are accessible to everyone. This was the result of significant work that started in 2016 with an assembly bill that gave the Commission authority to specifically consider environmental justice when making their permit decisions. However, the Commission still needed to provide guidance and clarity for Commission staff and public on how they will do this. So I wanted to share a couple of the engagement approaches and other approaches that they used to work on this task. The first step they took was to form an environmental justice team on their staff, and this team did a number of things. They participated in a racial equity training through the Government Alliance on Race and Equity. The team conducted extensive public outreach efforts, including interviews with people in communities across the different coastal regions of California. And keep in mind, California's shoreline is about 1,100 miles on the outer coast. They focused specifically on reaching environmental justice communities and California Native American tribes to understand their concerns and needs. And they took this feedback that they solicited and they used it to develop the first draft of the environmental justice policy and to inform the Commission's own strategy on how to integrate these principles throughout the agency. So on this slide, you're going to see what their approach is. It includes not only the development of the policy, but also a racial equity plan and a 5-year strategic plan to provide for ongoing accountability for implementation. Now, the Commission's policy is organized around a statement of environmental justice principles that inform the Commission's implementation of the law. So you'll see the topics that are covered by those principles on this slide. And I just wanted to mention that some of the next steps, they'll be looking to hire additional staff to support EJ policy implementation and develop training for staff and local governments on this. And just a couple of lessons learned shared by staff. They noted that their policy development process was slow. It took about 3 years to develop and get it adopted. And so one of the things they did was make sure to continually communicate in between big actions and steps to make sure folks knew it was still moving forward and to keep them engaged. Another thing I wanted to share is that even though their team, they said they made a lot of mistakes, they spent a lot of time listening to their stakeholders and trying to learn from those mistakes to do better next time. So the San Francisco Bay Conservation Development Commission oversees development in the Bay. They also amended their policies this year to include environmental justice and social equity. And in fact, this just occurred in October, so just about 3 weeks ago. This was a result of also a significant amount of effort and time. They started back in 2015. They started with a project looking at their laws and policies related to climate change and impacts and threats from sea level rise. And they identified 4 overarching policy issues that they found inadequate, and environmental justice and social equity was one of the 4. And so moving forward in 2017, their commission voted to begin the process of amending their San Francisco Bay Plan to incorporate social equity and environmental justice into planning and permitting. Since that time, the commission and its staff, they engaged with EJ organizations and others to look at the intersection of environmental justice and social equity with coastal management issues, specifically public access, shoreline protection, adaptation, and mitigation. And some of their engagement strategies that I wanted to share, they conducted a couple of larger workshops, and in those workshops, they co-facilitated at least one of them, I believe, with an environmental justice coalition. They also hosted multiple smaller events around the region, and they worked closely with the Environmental Justice Review Team. So this was a team that was composed of representatives from Bay Area equity and social justice organizations, and their purpose was to provide recommendations for consideration of the development of these policies. The team, the Environmental Justice Team, is using from the resources to support their participation. And I highlight this because I think it's important that they've got a best practice here that they're implementing in terms of compensating people for the contribution of their time, their expertise, and their experience. This new policy is going to do a variety of things. It's going to require meaningful community involvement, require that disproportionate impacts are identified and addressed in their permitting and their planning, and using design principles in the evaluation of public access projects that are inclusive. They'll also be hiring a staff member whose role it is to support EJ and social equity in BCDC, at BCDC, and looking to develop guidance for applicants and permit staff. I wanted to share some of the lessons learned as well from them. The staff shared that it can take a long time to build trust with communities who have been discriminated against or treated unfairly. Also that it's important to resource community members for their time and expertise. People's lived experience facing and fighting environmental injustices should be treated the same as other forms of expertise. And also that we need more strategic thinking and problem solving about how we, in all levels of government, can move from the model of informing the public about decisions to empowering the public to be a decision maker. So I thought I would just share those with you. And before I move on from this slide, I just wanted to note that BCDC runs the Adapting to Rising Tides program. This is also known, you may have heard the term ART program. It provides planning guidance, tools, and information to address challenges of climate change. And the ART approach, it includes 4 sustainability frames to use in the full adaptation planning process. And society and equity is one of those frames. So if you are interested in checking this out, it's a great resource. They have all of the resources online, and they actually have a help desk that anybody can call up and talk to as well. And the last agency here I want to talk about was the State Coastal Conservancy. They're, as I mentioned, non-regulatory, primarily granting agency focused on a number of projects throughout California and supporting communities. One note is that they do have a strategic plan that includes 3 equity and justice objectives, and they've also outlined numerical targets for those. One of them focuses on increasing coastal access for all Californians. So they have a grant program called Conservancy's Explore the Coast Grant. This program acknowledges there can be many barriers to accessing the coast, including both the cost and difficulty of transportation. So one of the priorities for this program is to fund programs for people who may experience challenges getting to the coast or enjoying the coast. And this can include youth and their families, especially students in Title I schools, low-income and disadvantaged communities, and persons with disabilities and tribes. So they've funded, I think, since 2013, about $6 million worth in 200 separate grants. And so this is one of the pictures from one of those grant programs. Here's another picture. And I just wanted to close with the Conservancy, noting that they're working on developing justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion guidelines to direct their work on a variety of topics. As they're developing these guidelines, they have been conducting significant stakeholder engagement. And again, just wanted to share some of their practices here. They are, these stakeholder engagements are led in part by people in environmental justice work. They've included a series of target interviews with tribal representatives to obtain more in-depth feedback. And they've had 5 focus groups throughout the state that are organized and facilitated by EJ advocates. And finally, for them, two lessons that they shared with me. It is critical to work with EJ organizations and community representatives to design programs and projects. Don't rush the process. Take the time to really listen and understand and share decision-making power with the people you are charged with serving. And another lesson is to focus on your agency's internal work, your hiring, retention, promotion, and training efforts. You need a culturally competent workforce with a goal for diversity across the depth and breadth of your agency if you want to meaningfully work with under-resourced communities. And so I'll just close here by bringing it back in terms of the Office for Coastal Management. We are really thinking about how can we best support the transfer and sharing of lessons and strategies across the entire coast of the country. Since we're not always working hand in hand with the community, we really need to think about leveraging our partners and the networks we have to help. So I just spent time sharing about what is going on in California because I sit in Oakland, California, and I work directly with these partners. But I have about 250 colleagues that are working around the country who are collectively also hearing and learning about not just successes, but also challenges in trying to implement equitable planning. So we feel we've got a really great opportunity and a responsibility from our perspective to advance this work and share the good work within our network and beyond. We've started doing this in a variety of ways. For example, in the California examples I shared, we've been supporting with CZMA funding a variety of the different things that they've been doing. In the New Jersey example that Janie shared, we supported, as she mentioned, funding there for that project. And we're also supporting a little bit of instructional review for what they're creating through the project. We have instructional designers on our staff. And doing that with an eye towards how we might be able to incorporate some of the key information they're creating into our trainings for our broader network. And I'll just close by saying that we are newer to this, and we know there is so much more we can do and learn. So we're really looking forward to identifying effective ways to further support both our partners and the coastal community efforts around the country. Thank you.
Okay, hey, it's Robin. I'm going to try to hopefully share my screen here. Okay, yep, it's up. Okay, yeah, it was a little bit delayed for me. So I've been working with the New York City panel on climate change for quite a few years now. And so what I'm going to share is my experience with working with them to sort of build equity and bring equity into the process of planning for adaptation for communities in New York. But it sort of very much echoes what we've heard from the other presenters, but I think also it's sort of like a slightly different angle because our role was actually sort of bringing some of the lessons of sort of environmental justice work and sort of how environmental justice approaches the issue of climate change and sort of bringing that back to the city and sort of kind of helping them kind of build a framework and a template for including climate change in adaptation planning going forward. So just moving up, let me get all right, that's better. Yeah, so these are just some of the prior reports of the New York City panel on climate change. The first one is, or this slide is the most recent report. And that, so what I'm going to be presenting today is actually already available in a chapter that came out a few months ago, if anyone's interested in following up. So in terms of the equity research group, what New York City asked us to do was to sort of help them think about bringing equity into the adaptation planning process for communities. But what was sort of interesting about the work in some ways was that they had, they already had a very strong tradition of including, attention to socially vulnerable populations, and had an awareness of that piece, and also had some of the kind of basic tenets of equity in terms of involving community participants, some of the things that we've already been hearing about doing, sort of outreach with communities, connecting with communities. But I think where the pieces sort of didn't really fit together, and what we really tried to bring into the work with the group was to actually involve directly sort of the environmental justice groups and the community groups into sort of the whole design of the project itself, and sort of bringing that perspective, which we've heard about from, I think, almost every other presenter, this idea of collaborating with environmental justice communities in the development of sort of equitable plans for adaptation. And so that was kind of a tenet. And this particular project, we ended up partnering with 3 environmental justice groups in the city: Uprose, We Act, and The Point. And those groups became sort of, equal partners in terms of what are the questions that we need to be asking, how do we need to be approaching this project, and what kinds of guidance do we want to give the city. So it's just sort of a co-production approach through and through, from kind of beginning to end. And then just another thing that was sort of, kind of maybe hasn't been said before, and is kind of an innovation of the project, was that we really tried to think in terms of having like a really clear guiding framework for talking about equity in the context of climate change. So we defined equity in terms of several elements, including distributive equity, where you're thinking in terms of the equity that's sort of an approach to equity that really focuses on identifying which places are disadvantaged, using vulnerability mapping and other types of tools, and then targeting resources toward those places that need additional resources. And this was very much, I think, in starting the project, where what we were hearing was sort of the perspective of the city. And I think for many cities, if you ask them what does equity mean and what is that, how do you make things equitable, that distributive awareness is really what kind of comes up. And when I talk in a few minutes about the results from other states, I'll sort of emphasize that again. But then we also want to sort of bringing in kind of newer ways of thinking about equity. So this idea of contextual equity, where you're thinking about some of the ideas that we've already heard from other panelists, in terms of social, economical, political factors that sort of structural racism, factors that are sort of creating a context where inequalities are sort of perpetuated, exacerbated, and so forth. And then also, of course, thinking in terms of equity, in terms of sort of a very traditional kind of procedural way of, sort of the idea of having sort of a robust participatory process, having sort of those, even like the kind of idea of recognition equity, which we didn't have a separate category for recognition equity, but we really tried to make our procedural approach have that sort of inclusive component. And so in thinking about the project, we were trying to really incorporate these different elements of equity into the different pieces. So we've already seen a whole bunch of social vulnerability maps. So I guess I'm showing just one more using the SVI method. And we ended up, what was interesting about this work, and I actually think this was maybe brought up already in one of the other presentations, this idea of using not only using kind of the metrics where you're kind of using these kind of combined indices to identify places that are socially vulnerable, and the areas circled in this slide are the three case study areas, but also using maybe single indicators. So using the indicator maps that were that were, you know, sort of the indicators that went into the indices, the actual, in terms of the value for the city and the value for, even the value for some of the communities that we worked with, those single indicators were in some ways seen as a little bit more informative. So what I mean by single indicators would be like areas where high percentage of, you know, well, someone already mentioned poverty, so high percentage of poverty, or areas where a high percentage of the population, you know, there's sort of certain, you know, like a particular variable that emphasizes, you know, populations that are disabled, populations that are sort of medically compromised and so forth, getting at sort of variables that are slightly more fine-grained and more specific for, you know, kind of having that value in terms of, you know, informing the distributional equity understanding. And then what we also did in the project was we did a series of community case studies where we were working directly with these environmental justice groups and then looking into really kind of more the contextual equity piece and trying to understand, you know, conditions that were sort of creating vulnerabilities and also conditions or sort of guidance in terms of how to enhance adaptation. So I'll just show a few pictures. So one of our communities that we worked at was Sunset Park in Brooklyn. This was the Uprose community. This is a waterfront, a significant, I mean, it's an interesting neighborhood in terms, for many reasons, but one of the kind of standout things about it is that it's an active industrial waterfront. It's one of the last sort of active working waterfronts that's still, you know, sort of in New York City. And so that sort of working waterfront piece also means that it's, you know, vulnerable, economically vulnerable to flooding and so forth, but that also there's sort of this overlapping question of sort of prior environmental justice issues, prior sort of environmental toxins and pollutions that are already present in the community as a result of sort of such a high concentration of industry, which then someone else mentioned, I think it was Drew mentioned earlier, the idea of sort of this toxic soup happening after Sandy, and that was exactly the kind of stories we were hearing from this neighborhood in terms of their experience of prior flooding. And then I'll just jump through the other three because I know that time is tight. Hunts Point Bronx was another community that we were focusing on. One of the standout points from this area is that it's the home of the food distribution center, which serves the entire, you know, the entire sort of island of Manhattan, and really the entire city and sort of broader region. This was very, very nearly flooded by Hurricane Sandy. It was just about 1 foot from actually reaching and actually overtopping and flooding the food distribution center. So that was sort of almost like one of those where Sandy could have been much, much worse for the New York region. It wasn't, but just in terms of preparedness and sort of resilience in this region, one of the things that we were hearing a lot about was that because this area is so significant in terms of its role as a, you know, sort of industrial site and a food distribution center, it's also very highly sort of traveled by trucks. And so the kind of one of the environmental justice issues here was very much around air quality and around sort of diesel pollution, and then overlapping with, you know, sort of, you know, high heat event days. So it wasn't, although flooding was sort of a lot of the story, there was also a very strong narrative around heat and a concern for extreme heat here, and also in the case in northern Manhattan, we were also hearing quite a bit about, you know, there was flooding risks along the kind of coastline or along the river, but also significant sort of air pollution concerns in our other community in northern Manhattan. So just sort of that was just very quickly in terms of the context for these places and just some of the insights from the case studies. One of the things that we sort of, which is, as I think already mentioned, this idea of gentrification, but this real concern that climate stresses are only one of the big factors and one of the big pressures and stresses that these neighborhoods are facing. They're already facing a lot of environmental justice issues that haven't been resolved. So facility siting, air pollution, runoff. We talked about CSOs in Newark, and CSOs are also present here, combined sewer overflow issues. And so I think like bringing an awareness of climate change and the need to talk about climate change, but sort of from the community's perspective, really placing climate change into a context of a whole suite of stresses and pressures that they're facing. And then this idea of procedural equity is sort of moving beyond just, sort of that kind of, maybe more simple public meeting approach to procedural equity, but really having an approach that includes communities in all phases of adaptation planning. And I think this is something that many of the other talks have already mentioned, but this was definitely a very strong outcome, probably almost one of the strongest outcomes of the community case studies was this need and desire to be involved in planning from start to finish. And then so just briefly, I'll just say that we also in this study took a look across cities, and we're trying to understand how are other cities incorporating equity into their adaptation planning, and what are they doing. And I don't have time to go into that piece in terms of much detail, but just to mention sort of that the idea that distributional equity is what cities are kind of most familiar with and most used to doing. That was definitely echoed in all of the other cities that we heard, that they had very elaborate plans and elaborate sort of approaches to making sure that they were identifying vulnerable populations, that they were developing programs that sort of targeted vulnerable areas. But maybe, the emphasis was, not quite as sort of maybe, I don't know, complex and as sort of rich in terms of how to do procedural equity and how to do contextual equity. Most of them are doing procedural equity along the lines of very traditional models, not so, and less so using more collaborative co-production type of approaches. Contextual equity was mostly recognized in terms of needing to have employment practices that were equitable within city agencies, but and there was certainly an acknowledgement of bigger sort of contextual issues, structural racism and so forth, but I think much less so in terms of really explicit ways to sort of bring a sort of real sort of approach to addressing contextual equity. I think that's sort of, some of those are sort of the challenges that are yet to be developed. So just in terms of just a quick conclusion, I think, and this I think fits with all this talks we've already heard, the idea that climate change, it really is an equity issue, and that to do climate change well, to address climate change in a sustainable way, that we will have to really bring equity into the conversation. So just before I close, I just want to acknowledge, if I can get to those next slides. Well, I do have 2 more slides. Oh, there they are. Just to acknowledge all my co-collaborators in the working group. All right, well, thank you.
Well, thank you so much to all of our speakers this morning. This has been incredibly informative, and I appreciate everyone's attendance and support for the International Division and World Town Planning Day. I know there's a number of questions. I think in the interest of time, we'll close the session for now, but you will receive an email with some contact information if you want to direct your questions to specific panelists. So thanks again for joining, and hope everyone has a terrific day.